Welcome back to Map the Maze, officially episode 42, unofficially YouTube episode 2. I recently did a workshop in Hong Kong for the Women's Foundation. So working with mentors and mentees who are looking at ways to, enhance their skills and manage some of the challenges that they face in the workplace. The workshop I did was on something called difficult conversations. Now, apart from being a book, so that makes it easy, it's also just a concept that I think people talk about in communication. And definitely when I was thinking about the material and thinking about what I wanted to put together, difficult conversations is the reality of my day-to-day. It is, to put it in other words, my bread and butter. That every day people are coming to have conversations that are difficult for all sorts of reasons. Maybe because it's conversations they don't want to have. They've maybe never wanted to have them. Maybe it's because it's about subjects that are triggering for them, whether that's about the divorce or separation, or it's difficult to talk about money or children, whether that's because the person that they're talking with is challenging for them, that it's somebody who is not great at listening, doesn't really understand multiple perspectives, that isn't open to at least hearing a different perspective. And so when I was thinking about the material to use for the Women's Foundation, I was really thinking about what is it that I see every day, and also what is my personal experience from working in investment banking and in the law that I could use and bring. And I think I said in the very first podcast, my whole ethos is around pain reduction. That as somebody who worked in business before I went off and did my master's and studied dispute resolution, I really had very few skills that were of any assistance to me in navigating the conflicts that I was experiencing. And so I guess as a convert, I really appreciate having conflict resolution skills and tools. They don't always work, and they don't work in all situations, but at least I know if I'm in a difficult conversation, I can try this tool. Okay, that tool doesn't work. Let's try the bigger tool. Okay, that tool doesn't work. Let's try the next tool. And if it really does go badly, at the end of the day, I also know, okay, I've got a system for thinking about what happened. How do I make it better next time? So I thought it might be helpful to share some of the things that I shared with the Women's Foundation on this podcast, because the reality is that if you are separating or divorcing, whether you're using family mediation or not, the chances are you are going to have some difficult conversations from time to time with either your co-parent or your former partner. And I wanted to kind of use some of the work that I'd done for the Women's Foundation to inform this podcast and to share with you guys. So I guess the first thing to note is that I think it's helpful to think about difficult conversations in 3 parts. So before, during, and after, which is what I'm strangely going to do with these podcast episodes. So today we're going to think about what can I do before I get into the difficult conversation to give myself the best chance of making this conversation constructive, if that is in fact what you want to do. So first thing, so I'm looking down, I'm just looking at my notes. The first thing was actually understanding yourself. And last week, one of the things I mentioned was that our families of origin inform so much of our responses when we are triggered, when we're stressed, when we're in conflict. And understanding that is really key. That I think a lot of people don't have a good sense of, or don't maybe reflect on what was it like growing up as a child in your family. If there was conflict, how did it get resolved? How was it managed? Did people surface issues, or were issues suppressed? Were people okay talking about their emotions and expressing how they felt, or were they not? Was that something to be avoided? So understanding where you come from and also what you're likely to do in a highly stressful situation, I think is really helpful as a first stage. The second thing I would say is also reflecting on your own personal experience. So, for example, I trained initially as a solicitor in the UK. So I was working primarily in litigation, although I really preferred commercial work. But when I came back to Hong Kong, I was working as a litigator. And so that gives you a particular training, perspective, lens to look at issues. And certainly, strangely, when I went into banking, I found that those skills that I had acquired as a criminal litigator, because that's primarily what I was doing, were really helpful on the trading floor, working with traders and salespeople. So I guess I would say understanding what your professional training, what your work experience, what your life has kind of given you in terms of skills, really helpful to understand and reflect on how do I respond to conflict. So there are some online tests that you can do, and I'll put some of those in the reference below. So for example, there is something called the Thomas Kilmann instrument, which you can do online. I think you can do online yourself. There are some mini versions, but there's a full version that kind of reflects what is your preference in conflict, what is your style. I would say I think a lot of it is also very applicable to negotiation style. So if you've done any analysis around what you're like in negotiations, then chances are that it'll be similar to how you are in conflict, that we don't really always associate these two, but in a dispute resolution, they are cozy bedfellows. So I think understanding is the first part. I think also reflecting on what is it you want to try and achieve from this conversation. So I've just recently read, it's an old book, but it's a good one on negotiation called Getting More by Stuart. Again, I'll put that link in the description. And he talks about not letting yourself become distracted. Keep an eye on the goal. So what is it? First question, what is my goal? What is it that I want to achieve from this conversation? There is some negotiation theory analysis around how do I choose what style I apply to this negotiation? Am I going to be competitive? And am I going to be collaborative? And they suggest things looking at the stakes. How important is this issue to me? Is it something that's really of minimal importance, or is this something that's really critical? Is this something that I'm going to have a relationship with this person going forward, or is this a one-off interaction? So if you are in a mediation with your co-parent, that's a continuing relationship that you are going to be a co-parent for as long as there are children. But if it is maybe you're in the market and you're buying something and you're never going to see this vendor again, that's a one-off. It doesn't really matter if the relationship isn't strengthened by what's happened. And the third one they talk about is time. What's the deadline to achieve your goal? If it's really time sensitive, you may be more willing to, for example, accommodate the other person in order to win on the time element. So using those three questions, issue importance, relationship, time, you can then assess, well, how should I be in this negotiation even before you've started? So I think preparing, really key. So understanding yourself, understanding your goals, actually assessing those and understanding what am I trying to achieve, and then not allowing yourself to become distracted, really important. And the third one is maybe even reading that book, Difficult Conversations, which I'll also put below. I did read it when I was doing my master's, and I have to say I didn't enjoy it as an experience. And then a couple of years ago, I reread it, just thinking about difficult conversations in general. And it was like reading a different book. I suddenly thought, this is really interesting. I can see how it applies, and it really resonated for me. So I kind of gone from being a skeptic about the book to being a fan, but I would recommend it if you're interested in this area. But they really say that below any conversation, below any difficult conversation, there are three conversations going on. The one that we're all really familiar with, what happened? Who's to blame? What should have happened? What should happen? What didn't happen? Whose fault is that? And often, at least in mediation, that's a conversation I think a lot of people are very familiar with. We know how to have that conversation. It's easily accessible to us. We don't struggle to think about it. But it's the tip of the iceberg, essentially, is what they're suggesting. The second conversation is the feelings conversation. So how did what happened affect me? How do I feel about it? How do I feel about you? What was the impact on me? And that conversation, they say, is challenged because when we come into the what happened conversation, we assume we know what happened and we are right, and that we need to persuade the other person that we are right. When we get to the feelings conversation, we assume the intention of the other person. We know the impact on us, but we also add to that certainty, at least in our own minds, about why they did that. Why did they behave the way that they did? And what they suggest is we actually need to shift to a curious mindset. Instead of assuming that we have all the answers and assuming that we're right, we need to stop and actually explore, which is really, very resonant. If you've listened to any of these other podcasts about mediation, that's very much where mediation comes from. A curious mindset, a questioning mindset, a mindset that's open to new information. And the third conversation that they talk about beneath difficult conversations is identity. And I think that's one that's really hard for people to surface. And it can be around, in the workplace, it might be around, am I competent? Am I incompetent? Am I good at what I do? Am I bad? Which can obviously be very strongly tied to identity. But in family mediation, I think it's even clearer. It's more stark that what we're seeing is people whose relationships, whose intimate adult relationships are breaking up, whose families are breaking up. And so now it's that identity around, well, I was a wife, I was a husband, I was a mother, I was a father, I had a partner, I had a family. Now all of that is changing. All of that is being threatened. All of that is in flux. So what does that mean for my identity? So I think when we analyze family mediation conversations, they very clearly align with that framework of the what happened, the feelings, conversation, identity. And what they say is, again, we need to shift to a sort of more nuanced and more subtle view of what's happening, that our identities are not based on all black or all white thinking. We're not all good. We're not all bad. The other people in the conversation are not all good or not all bad. We're all a mix. We've all made mistakes. We're all not perfect. So tying our identity to one aspect, like being in a marriage, is really difficult, that we need to have a very varied, a diverse view of how our identity is formed, that we need to be able to do that for ourselves and for the other person. So I think those are some really interesting ideas about how to make difficult conversations into what they call learning conversations. So I would say, and I said this when I did the workshop, that is an amazing concept. And definitely if you can turn a difficult conversation into a learning conversation, I think you're ahead of the game. I think you're likely to find your life has less conflict and that you are learning a huge amount about other people and yourself. The challenge is we don't always have the energy. We don't always have the capacity. We don't always have the time. And I think what I'm seeing a lot of at the moment is people feel like their tanks are on empty, that there is very little capacity in the system to expend that effort, to do that work up front. I think it helps in the long run, and I think it is worth doing. I think if you do have to have a difficult conversation, particularly if it's an ongoing relationship like a co-parent, then this effort up front will actually pay dividends later on. So I guess very similar to some of the ideas that John Gottman has around communication, that we can kind of put some deposits in the co-parenting bank that will pay dividends later on, because there will be bumpy days. There will be days when we snap and we have, low patience levels. But if we have tried to have some learning conversations up front, there will be some deposits in the bank, which can then be debited against that snarky day. So I guess I would say difficult conversations, not just in the workplace, not just in family mediation, a couple of takeaways. Know yourself. So do that reflection. Actually understand, who am I? How do I respond to conflict? How might I look to the other person when I'm under stress and in conflict? Actually think about preparing. What is it that I really want to achieve from this conversation? What do I need to achieve? What goal do I need to achieve that I don't already have? And then understanding, how do I shift a difficult conversation to a learning conversation? What are some of the ways I might do that? So I definitely strongly recommend difficult conversations. I'll put this all in the below. Getting more, and maybe thinking about doing an online assessment if you are wondering, how do I reflect more deeply on how I present in conflict, what my thoughts are about conflict, how I deal with conflict in my life. Okay, so next week, excitingly, I will be talking with you about during. Yeah. So what do you do during a difficult conversation to make it better? If you only remember one word from today, and I said this at the workshop last week, just make it curiosity. That if you can come from a curious mindset, a mindset that doesn't assume that you have all the information, that understands the other person might have different information or even a different perspective, that I think you will find difficult conversations become easier. That curiosity is an amazing tool that I think we don't use as much as we should. So have a good week. Take care. And I will see you next week. Bye-bye.